So this is the first time I've delivered this session. So I've delivered a session before and I did one last week. Yeah. On supporting trainees with developing evidence for OTAs. And I did that one earlier in the year as well. So I did it about February time, I think. And sort of a similar time, it might have been March, I delivered one. Although I called it supporting trainees with developing evidence for DTAs, it was actually the focus ended up being on the core module, the SC1 specifically, so the professional foundations module. And I'll be repeating that in the new year, I think. And that, but it will be just on that professional foundation. So this is the first time I've sort of done it around the specialist modules. So basically the specialist versions of the DTAs and of course the ETAs as well. So hopefully it'll work and hopefully it'll be useful. Because obviously the big challenge with doing it for the specialist modules is that there's about 29 different specialties. So I've tried to do a couple of things that might help when supporting your trainees with those types of training activities and modules. There is variation as well. So you've got some like clinical engineering, for example, that is dominated by DTAs. And then you've got other specialisms that have got very few DTAs and mainly ETAs. So, you know, there's lots of caveats with some of this as we go along. But anyway, after me making lots of excuses that I preempt that it might, we'll make a start and see how we get on. So as it says on the title, we're looking specifically at sort of the strategies you can employ to support your trainees with developing this evidence, but also, looking at the role of reflection as part of that, because that is going to be a significant part of the evidence as well. But there's obviously going to be wider evidence development too, in order, especially for the specialist modules. Just to draw your attention to the Learning Hub resources, if you haven't accessed them already, our catalogue is easy to find on the Learning Hub, but I've put the QR code for it, that first QR code there. If you haven't got a Learning Hub account, it's really easy now to create one yourself. Before, if you didn't have an NHS email address, you used to have to come via me for me to endorse you to get one and request one on your behalf. But now you don't, it's not a problem. You can use any email address. And apart from our catalogue, obviously, I want you to use our catalogue, but there is a wealth of other resources on there. So if you haven't accessed that before, there's like specialist ones as well. But what I would say is look at that training for trainers, training for trainers section, because there are a lot of modules on there to support people. Things around feedback that's going to be very relevant to supporting trainees with their specialist modules, but also all sorts of things about developing independent learners. And I will be referring to some of that as part of this too today. We're going to use Slido today, and we're going to have a couple of polls sort of couple of opportunities for you to share some of your practice and some of your ideas around developing evidence for certain types of training activity. And also this is where you'll post your questions as well, but I'll bring that up again when we use it. So I'm going to just define what the specialist training activities are in terms of what we mean by DTAs and ETAs. Now, I'm sure you know, but it's just to break that down a little bit, because that will help us in terms of talking about the different like sort of the evidence that trainees could develop, provide for that. So in terms of related to the specialist training activities, so we're going to ignore the core DTAs, core modules today, which are DTAs as well. We're just looking at the specialist training activities, so those specialist modules. And of course, yeah, they can be either DTAs or ETAs, and a lot of specialisms do have a mix of both. There's just off the top of my head, I think it's only clinical engineering that is 100% DTAs, and it's just the nature of that specialism. Some have more of one than the other type, and others are a little more equally split. It just depends on the nature of that specialty that the trainee is entering into. So we've got a comparison there basically of what the purpose of those are. So in terms of the purpose of the DTAs, these activities are there to support trainees to develop and improve their practice, but they're usually activities that are undertaken less regularly in the workplace. So they're really used for the trainee to develop insight into practice, but the trainee isn't expected to have mastered those activities by the end of the programme. In contrast to the ETAs, so these are where they're expected to develop the skills required for that routine post-programme practice in their specialty. And they're tasks or activities that are undertaken very frequently in the workplace. So they're sort of their bread and butter stuff. And they're expected to be able to perform these activities themselves without that direct supervision when it's safe to do so. And that's a big part of it as well, is that they understand when not to do it independently as well, and when to get refer up. Which leads us to this. So the purpose of the evidence needs to, for the DTAs, should demonstrate, so they should submit evidence that should demonstrate that that activity that they've undertaken has contributed to the development of their own practice and identified areas that would need continual development. And that continual development won't necessarily be signed off during the course of the programme. It could be further in the future as well, because it's recognising that that training activity or that experience won't be something that's routine, so they won't necessarily come across it again in the course of their actual training programme, but it's likely that it could come up again in the future, and they need to be prepared for that and recognise what they might need to do in order to be able to, fulfil that. Let me go back, I just skipped forward. And then we've got the ETAs, and this means entrustable training activities. And that word entrustable, or being entrusted, means that they can be you as their assessor, stroke training officer, and them themselves as a professional by the end of the programme, to the point where they're able to register with the HCPC when they're, as a clinical scientist, they should be able to be entrusted to undertake that task without direct supervision. But also, as I mentioned before, they need to be entrusted to know when not to undertake the task. So in what circumstances that it wouldn't be safe for them to to solely take responsibility for it, because it's out of their own scope of practice. with respect to that specific activity. So that's the purpose of the evidence, needs to demonstrate that they understand that and they're able to do that. So in terms of the evidence submitted, what the school's assessment standards state is that you need evidence that the trainee is actually undertaking that activity. So this is for DTAs. So they've got to have evidence that they have undertaken it. And it might just be once, so there might be just something very straightforward that shows that they've undertaken it. And you can agree with them what that might be. And they need to have a reflection, one or more points in time, and we'll talk about that a little bit later this morning. And, so one of those is going to be after the event. And you might agree that, because it depends on the context of the actual training activity itself, you might say the reflection also provides that evidence that they've undertaken the activity. That's fine. There might be others that you want a little bit of additional evidence, which we'll come to after, that actually you're satisfied that they did take part in that activity. And for example, that might be a witness testimony from somebody to say, yes, this trainee did do X, etc. Okay. And then what has to be in place is an action plan, because obviously it's developmental, these training activities. It's about them being able to identify what learning they need to implement, or what skills they need to address, or knowledge gaps they've identified as a result of that activity, so that before they encounter that activity again, what things they need to do in or encounter that situation again, or a similar situation in the future, what they need to do in order to improve and be prepared for that. The ETAs, on the other hand, so the entrustable training activities, as we said, it's their bread and butter stuff. So it's the things that they would be able to be expected to be able to do independently. And what we mean by independently is without direct supervision. So it might be that there's somebody somewhere that they can draw upon at any given time if they feel it's out of the scope of their practice. But on the whole, they'll be doing this repeatedly, consistently, and effectively over time in a range of situations. So that's what the difference is with the ETAs to the DTAs. And then they're expected to reflect at multiple time points. And again, we'll talk about what that looks like shortly. But what's worth remembering with the ETAs, they're not just going to evidence the times that they've actually done it independently. They're going to also evidence occasions, if they come up, where the trainee has not successfully achieved the outcome of the activity for themselves, but that might have actually been appropriate in that situation, that they didn't actually undertake it themselves, that they were able to recognise their own limitations of their practice and sought help and advice appropriately to ensure that the activity reached a successful conclusion. And being able to recognise that scope of practice is obviously a big part of safety and being a trusted or entrusted to be a safe pair of hands, if you like, in relation to that activity. So if you came to the OTA one, this comes up. This I try to reiterate every time before we embark on looking at different types of evidence and so on, because the selection of evidence is going to be personal to their specialism and their own training journey. So you could have two trainees, both in phase one of their training on the same specialism, But the evidence they gather for individual training activities might be different because it depends on their previous experience and all sorts of, how well they're picking up um, certain tasks, etc., and all sorts of different factors. So the sort of, particularly in work-based assessment, it's different to when you're talking about university assessments. University assessments are pretty much set. You all complete this essay, etc., or whatever. Whereas with this, although they've got, yeah, you all have to complete these or meet the requirements of the program, including these individual different training activities, the evidence they submit might vary because it depends upon their own learning or training journey. I just heard a ping on the thing. Make sure I let that person in. Um, so yeah, so what I was going to mention there as well is that sort of accumulated skills development and knowledge that the trainees have developed by completing the training activities, whether they're DTAs or ETAs for a module, those skills they've developed are collectively, if you like, showcased to you or an assessor or both by completing those in-person work-based assessments. So whether it's DOPS, OCEs, or CBDs, that's where they're bringing that knowledge together and showing that consolidation of their ability to actually respond to those end of module assessments. So, big part of it is reflection. Now, I'm sure a number of you might have already heard me talk about reflection before in the context of OTAs potentially, or the core module for professional foundations, but we're going to link it to the specialist. One, same principles, same model that we've adopted. Basically, just as a recap, reflection is about learning from doing, but it's more than just having an experience. It's actually taking that step back and reflecting on it and critically analysing what happened. And that can lead to improved practice through gaining that greater insight. Because sometimes we can, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, I know I have, that you can be in the sort of treadmill of your, of routine tasks and whatever, and firefighting here, and uh, firefighting things that crop up and etc. And sometimes we don't give ourselves, or we don't get the opportunity to take that step back and actually consider what's happened and what we could do differently, or analyze situations and get the meaning from them, and that can feed into our future practice. So it can be, be quite difficult to find the time to do that sometimes. But this is a big part of trying to embed this in trainers early on. So not just for the purpose of their training program and ticking off training activities, but trying to develop this sort of deeper learning and developing those reflective practice skills that will help them in the future as well. So just to say, I'll link it quite strongly to Moon's 5 stages of learning. I really like Jenny Moon's sort of approach to reflective practice, very practical. I find that, I can relate much better to it. And actually, I came to her sort of writings quite late in my career because, I've taught about reflection, etc. But I came across Jenny's more so since starting this role, and I found that doing the model that she presents around these 5 stages of learning really make sense when it comes to looking at work-based practice and work-based training, rather than more academic, potentially sort of reflection. So she has these 5 stages of learning. So you've got surface learning and deeper learning, and sort of first two and a half, if you like, is very much that related to that surface learning. So you start in, a trainee might register a topic, event, or incident, or not just a trainee, any of us. So it could be somebody registers something as being interesting or important in some way. So it is very much about identifying when something might be worthy of reflection. So it's not about reflecting on absolutely everything. It's about saying, actually, that element of it really stood out to me for one reason or another. It could be that it challenged their preconceived ideas about something. It could be that they did much better at it than they thought they were going to do, or something really, something through the, for there was a spanner thrown into the works, if you like, and it went, something they've done multiple times before with different patients, let's say, and it's gone fine. They suddenly did it today and it just fell flat. So, they identify something that, they notice something that might be worthy of them reflecting. Stage 2 is about making sense of it. So they start to think about what they've noticed and try to understand it better. So it's very surface sort of reflection at that point. They're taking a step back and just considering some aspects of it. Stage 3 is where they're starting to make meaning of it. And this is the pivotal point where we move from this surface learning to starting to think deeper about the experiences that we have. So in this context, the trainee starts to ask questions and to connect ideas together. So they start to sort of make connections between their own behaviours and the responses that they got, or things, start to unpick why things didn't quite go to plan, or they did work, or why something happened when it did. And then stage 4 is when we're starting to move, into this deeper learning. So they start to make links with previous experiences or events. They might refer back to things that they've observed others do as well. So if you think of the OTAs where they're observing other people's practice, they might start to, at this stage, for their specialist ones, think, well, actually, this is how I saw the consultant approach that, or this is how I saw that person approach that, and maybe that's something that I could adopt in my own practice next time that might help me. So this is where reflection is actually starting. And then at stage 5, what is referred to as transformative learning is where they change practice in light of that reflection. They actually implement they formulate new ideas and actually start to implement those new ideas too, of their own, and adapt their practice according to those reflections. So alongside that, we've got this 4-dimensional approach to reflection, which you probably have come across by now if you've seen some of the other webinars that I've delivered, looking at reflect before, reflecting on, and beyond. So common ones before was reflect in and reflect on, and they were championed, if you like, by Sean, who, in the 1980s. And they've been common practice, basically. Thank you to anyone who, oh no, they're still there in the lobby. That's so they were championed early on in a lot of sort of approaches to reflection. But since we've had this introduction of reflect before and reflect beyond, so the work-based assessment standards, the school's work-based assessment standards mention about reflecting at different time points. So with OTAs, it's reflecting um, two or more, if I remember off the top of my head. DTAs, it's one or more, and then ETA, so in trustable ones, it just says multiple times, and we'll come to why shortly. Now, this shows four different time points, but I would say all four are actually good practice, regardless of what the training activity said. And that doesn't mean that a trainee has to do extra work. I would just say that it takes a natural sort of cycle to actually do it at multiple points. But it doesn't mean that they have to evidence all four. It just means that they would have gone through, might find it useful actually as for learning and development and for their training to actually take a step, take a moment to actually engage with all four. So reflect before, self-explanatory in a sense. It's about pre-flex, sometimes referred to as pre-flexion because it happens before the experience. I think it relates really well to that noticing sort of stage of learning identified by Moon, because it's where you or your trainee or the professional identifies that a situation that they're about to embark on is either significant in some way or familiar to them, or has some familiarity or common aspects to it, or transferable skills, requires transferable skills that they might have used before. It might be a new situation, but there might be things that they know that they can, a tool, they've got a toolkit within them that they can draw upon in order to respond to that situation. So they're thinking about it before they've even entered into it. And I would argue that's just good practice, that in terms of any professional, thinking about what you're going to do before you do it is actually something that we want to encourage, regardless of any given training activity. Reflect in action, again, self-explanatory, it happens during the event. And I would say that links very much with Moon's sort of making sense stage of learning, because it's about, the individual making sense of the situation as it unfolds in front of them. So it's about the decisions that you make during that event in response to what's happening in front of you. So, if you're dealing with people, they can be unpredictable. So what you might think might be a routine interaction, and whether that's with a patient or with another professional, we can't 100% be sure what's going to happen. So it's about how we adjust to what we're doing to best handle that situation in front of us. So it's very dynamic. And then reflect on action is what you would recognise as common to what we interpret as what reflection is. So it happens after the event. It's about us taking a step back, considering what happened, what we can learn from it, and how it might influence our future practice. So it's very much about that making meaning and working with meaning that Moon identifies with. And that this is where someone might adopt a particular model of reflection as a tool to help them with this. So, all the different models that are available, like Gibbs, Kolb, what was the other one that's gone off the top of my head, the person who did it? But basically the what, now what, so what, so what, now what? There's multiples out there. And it can be, it's about taking a step back, identifying what you can learn from the experience, but also what you can take from that experience now and move forward. It's forward thinking. It's looking back to move forward, basically, is one way of looking at it. And part of that reflect on action will probably incorporate how you reflected before and in, and how effective those were in actually helping you deal with that situation. And reflect beyond uh, is reflecting after, but quite a bit after. It's about revisiting your previous reflections and experiences to try and apply any new learning that you've gained since to that situation, but also revisiting those past situations in order to support you with new ones as well. So um, it links very strongly with Moon's transformative stage of learning. And it's very much about that sort of lifelong learning ethos of um, not treating sort of individual experiences as isolated incidences. It's about that sort of accumulative learning that we get from multiple experiences, from different experiences, or similar experiences, but also that sort of how they interlace, the learning from those interlaces to actually form the skill set that we've got, to form the person that we are, that professional that we are. So it's about revisiting that event later to apply any learning that you can gain from that situation to new situations as well. And a big part of that is also using professional storytelling. And that professional storytelling is very much about professionals sharing individual experiences of practice with each other. And it shows that reflection itself doesn't have to be that isolated activity. And, things like, I don't know if you use these in your own teams, but this thing's called action learning sets as an example, where you might bring a case to a group. And I'm not talking about like MDT type thing. It's more about looking at the learning that you can gain from it in terms of your own professional practice. So it's about bringing a case maybe to a group, a trusted group, and and how you dealt with it. So it's you bringing a reflection really to that group about a case, and you unpick, how they might have dealt with that situation, or they dealt with a similar situation and how that worked for them or didn't. And it can provide new insight for everybody, not just the person who's bringing that case. So there's lots of different ways that that could happen in the context of training activities and the trainees training. That reflect beyond action can be very much where they revisit their reflections and revisit their performance in those different training activities as part of a module, and how that's going to contribute to them fulfilling the in-person assessments for that module. Because obviously the training activities prepare them to be able to bring all that together in order to undertake that in-person assessment, whatever that might be. I just put that in for illustrative purposes, really, to show that how when they come to reflect on and beyond, they'll be drawing upon they reflect before and reflect in, and in turn, these are going to inform for next time how well prepared they are to reflect before, and how well they are responding in action during a situation as it unfolds. So in terms of reflection and the specialist training activities then, so we've got a bit of background there about where we're coming from. So as I mentioned before, DTAs, one or more points in time after the event, they've got to reflect. In trustable training activities, it's reflection at multiple time points. So in theory, DTAs, minimum of one reflection. ETAs, it could be, for one person, it might be 3, another person, it might be 10, because it just depends on that training activity and their own performance in it at different times. So we'll have a think about that now. So in terms of there we go. We've got some, thinking about their training activities. We've got the entrustable on the left, developmental on the right. So entrustable, they might have multiple incidences of engaging in that framework, whereas developmental, they might just do it once or twice, so that, as an illustration, that's what their portfolio might look like in terms of the reflections that they have. I've already sort of mentioned this, but reflecting at different time points for the DTAs, if they're only required to do it a minimum of once, why bother doing it at different time points? And as I've already said, I suppose where I come from, they don't have to obviously evidence it any more than the minimum. But I would say that it would be good practice to engage with that cycle, regardless of what type of training activity it is. Because, thinking about what we do before we do it is good practice. Thinking about what we're doing as we're doing it, also good practice. And adapting what we're doing as we're doing it, also good practice. And you might find that they want to revisit them, so they reflect beyond anyway, because it will help them when it comes to doing their in-person assessments. But like I said, they might just submit a reflection after the event. But during that reflection after the event, so that reflect on, they might actually refer to how they prepared for it, the planning for it, and how they reflected during it, and responded appropriately. So they could obviously demonstrate that full cycle to a certain extent within one reflection, but it shows different time points. And that, as long as you're happy with that, and we're perfectly happy with that. So I've just got a screenshot there of the general guidance I've produced for the 4-dimensional approach to reflection for developmental training activities. And if you haven't seen that already, it is on the Learning Hub. It's actually in text on the Learning Hub, but also you can download a document of it. I think it's probably PDF. It might be OpenDoc. I think they've started to accept Open Docs on there, and I might have put it in. And again, we've got the same for the ETAs as well. So the ETAs, rather, if I can spit it out, they need to reflect at different time points, and that could be multiple. And as I said, that could vary from one trainee to another for different training activities, because it depends on that individual trainee and how often they need to repeat that training activity until they've are entrusted to be able to do it independently of direct supervision. Just a note on, I'm just showing you this because I know people, when it comes to reflect on, so reflecting after the event, people struggle with models of reflection. And I always say that if you don't like a model of reflection, don't use it. It should be there as a tool to support reflection. And if it's creating a big barrier, then what's the point of using it? If it helps, obviously we've got the guidance, which actually step by step asks questions that they could actually, responding to those questions means they're reflecting. So they can just use that. Or another way of doing it is looking at it like this. This is reflect on, though, alone. So this is reflecting after. So just using those components means they're, following a model, but it's straightforward, because you find most models, if you unpick it, these are the components that they've got. There's basically a description of some kind of what happened. And this should be the shortest part of the reflection because it's just setting the scene. It's not a blow-by-blow account of everything that happened. It's selective, so it's only looking at the most significant information, and that might be very personal to that trainee, because It might be something that really stood out to them that they want to unpick and, that's going to help them progress further. It's not a police witness testimony or statement, so it doesn't, it can be bullet pointed, but it's not an essay either. So you don't want, who wants to read and who wants to write reams and reams and reams of every sort of thing that happened. It's about being selective. And it's not where the learning occurs. This just lays the foundation for that learning. Where the learning occurs is reviewing it and identifying what impact and what action they're going to take. So the review, might explain why the action or event was significant. Was it good, bad? Knowing why something was successful is just as important as knowing why something didn't quite go to plan, because you can use that learning to apply to other situations in the future that might not be directly the same, but they require the same set of skills in order to deal with them. Were there any surprises? How does it link to any prior knowledge and experience? How did what you do in practice, so that reflect in action? Was it the way that you reflected in action and responded to the situation? Was it effective? Or do you think that you just didn't reflect in action enough and you just plodded on when it wasn't actually appropriate to do so? All sorts of things that they can ask themselves there. So any significant moments that stuck out? Did you draw on sort of experiences of observing others, such as in the OTAs, that actually influenced your own practice? All sorts of things can come in there. And then, I've gone forward again, sorry. And then in terms of, so this is where the deeper learning occurs, basically, as they're unpicking the experience. And finally, that impact part and the action, that's how they identify how the experience is going to influence their own behaviour and attitudes in the future, what their next steps are, what they need to do to assimilate that new learning into their own practice. Do they need more exposure to similar types of activity? And that's very pertinent related to the ETAs. Do they need to repeat that activity again? Do they need to go and observe somebody else doing it because they find it, they're not sure if they're doing it correctly? All sorts of things that they can unpick there and identify for what they need to do next. And that might be in conversation with you or an assessor. It won't necessarily be something that they do in isolation, that they actually talk that through and identify some action points. And this is where their learning's reinforced and it actually makes it meaningful and turns it into actual practical steps to improve their practice or develop. So in terms of assessing reflections, the key thing is, out of all those, whether it's description, review, or impact or actions, is you're focusing on those. So obviously you need to know what it was, but the focus for assessment is very much about, well, what have you learned from it? What are you going to do moving forward? And of course, we know for DTAs, the action plan, it forms part of that evidence. It's a mandatory requirement of that. And I'll come to that shortly in a minute. And, some things to bear in mind when assessing reflections for specialist training activities is that you focus on the learning that they've gleaned from that experience. So that demonstrates that sort of growth mindset. There's the evidence of undertaking the activity. So it's about encouraging them to contextualize by providing examples. So not just saying, I think I need to improve my communication skills. Well, what makes you think that? What specific aspects of that experience tells you that you could have done better in that aspect of it? Or it might be that they anticipate that they might need to improve that because although they were successful in this, they're aware that they when communicating maybe with patients with dementia, for example, that they're going to need a different skill set in order to ensure that their communication skills are effective with that patient and with their carers, and all sorts of, different things might come out of that. They need to evaluate their self-awareness. You need to evaluate how well they're self-aware, rather. So when trainees reflect on their practice, have they considered their own feelings and tried to understand the perspective of others? Have they considered the impact of the experience on their future work-based training activities whilst on programs, so as they progress? So what transferable skills have they identified that are going to support them beyond the STP as well? And then there's self-assessment. So it's something I've added in there for specialist training activity. So the other 5 on screen, I've made reference to when we were looking at assessing reflections for OTAs. But it's also, I've put in self-assessment there for the specialist ones, because this is about them assessing, identifying for themselves how confident they now feel with the knowledge, practice, ability, skills, etc., that they have been exposed to as part of that training activity. How confident do they now feel with if they were faced with that activity again? And for the ETAs, that is particularly pertinent because they're going to have to undertake those in a independent. The expectation is they're able to undertake those training activities independently without direct supervision. So they need to develop their confidence in those as well. And how confident are they in actually being able to do that in an independent way? You would need to consider the depth of their reflections as well. And that doesn't mean quantity. You can have a deep reflection, as in, demonstrate deeper learning, but it doesn't have to be in pages and pages of prose. You could have somebody who writes a 2-page reflection, but it's just descriptive, and they haven't actually, so it's very surface learning that's very limited on what they've actually identified, what they've learned about themselves about it. So, but to begin with, they might lack depth, and that's not the end of the world at all, because through questioning, through a conversation, they can elicit more learning that way. But also getting feedback also will obviously help them develop deeper reflections. But it's about supporting them to be more critically, think more critically, having those critical thinking skills as well. And finally, we've got actions. So we know that an action plan is a requirement for the DTAs, but you'll probably find because of multiple engagement in a particular training activity for the ETAs, they're going to have multiple mini action plans potentially from each reflection, because every reflection is going to require them to think about, well, what actions do I now need to take to improve or make sure that I am entrusted to be able to do this activity independently? Well, that's going to require them to identify a series of mini actions that they're going to put into practice next time they do that activity. So it's that continuous cycle. I mentioned there about self-assessment. Now, this is really rudimentary, and you can use it if you want, but with your trainees, but this is just an example that I came up with. So, I will be apologetic about it if it's a load of rubbish, but it's just to try and sort of illustrate what I mean about encouraging your trainees to be, sort of self-assess, so they've got their reflection, but a simple conversation could be, this could be a simple tool to spark a conversation and discussion. So them identifying at the end of a training activity or having completed that training activity once, what skills did they get from it, and how confident they are at doing those skills now. So this is very rudimentary, so I apologize if it's a little bit too simplistic, but it can spark a conversation. So I've done sort of an example of how that might look, and it might have a little action plan with it to say, well, this is what I'm going to do to improve my patient communication or whatever. And it could be used by both of you. So you could almost do it on the trainee in terms of performance. You might say, well, in terms of your performance, I felt like it was, a 4. And they might say, well, confidence wise, I felt very much a 3. And it can spark that conversation between the two of you, and about, how that's going to inform your planning to support them, but also inform their own planning and actions, in terms of what action they're going to take in order to improve their practice or fill those gaps, really, in confidence. So we'll move on from that, just in case you think it was a load of rubbish. So in terms of action planning, I would say the action planning for entrustable training activities is very much in the short, medium term. So what they need to do to move to entrusted status in that activity. So it will most naturally happen as part of that reflective practice cycle. So specifically in relation to that reflect on and reflect beyond. So there'll be things like, what actions do I now need to take in order to be confident and to be able to be entrusted with this activity? Or when I come across it next week, I know I've got to redo this training activity again, but with in this different situation. How do I know, what am I going to do between now and then in order to be prepared for that? And also, it might be that they have an action plan for how, in relation to reflect beyond as well. So they might say, right, I know I'm going to have to undertake a CBD next week around X. Well, I remember that I did, I was successful in that in X, Y, and Z training activities, ETAs. So I'll revisit those just to remind myself how I approach those. And that will prepare me for that CPD that I'm doing next week. So, they're mini action plans, if you like. So, they might have multiple mini ones there. Whereas the developmental training activities, the action planning for that is more in the medium or long term. So they're identifying areas for future development, and those areas for future development may not be satisfied within the STP itself, because they might not come across that situation again for the duration of that of the program. So these are actions that are for the medium or longer term. So it could be post-qualifying or post-registration practice. Evidence for specialist modules then. In terms of what we expect when we're looking at developing evidence in the work-based context. And again, you might have seen this already if you came to the OTAs, but it's the same principles. You need to make sure it's authentic. You need to be confident that the evidence that they're producing and providing you with, you need to be confident that it's genuinely theirs. Okay. We know there's some safeguards in place through the electronic portfolio, so OneFile with Turnitin for detecting plagiarism, and AI tool, detection tool. But I would very much argue that the very unique nature of work-based evidence generation should also help to prevent it, because they're working in the environment that you work in. So, if they're trying to pass off evidence that isn't theirs, I think a lot of the time it can be picked up quite easily, because it doesn't feel authentic. And I think you can, with reflections particularly, identify when it does not feel authentic at all. It also needs to be valid, so basically relevant to that training activity. So it needs to be appropriate for that it gives that sort of accurate picture of their performance within that particular area that they're looking at. And the next one is reliability. So it's got to be sufficient in quantity, quality, and relevance. So as I said before, you could have a two A4 page reflection. I put that in inverted commas there because, and it might not reflect at all. It might literally be a description, blow by blow account of what happened. And so it doesn't actually demonstrate their learning for that or their ability to undertake that activity. So in terms of quantity, it's too much quantity, not enough quality or relevance. Another example of that is if a trainee presents a witness testimony as evidence of them performing a task to you, then you need to have confidence that the witness in that case is a reliable person to being a witness, i.e., they need to be at the right level and have the necessary credentials to be able to be a witness for that task. So it's about sufficiency of evidence. So there's enough evidence to say, yes, I can rely on this evidence to say that this person has undertaken this task and is able to do it. But also it goes the other way, that it could be a lot of evidence there, but actually when you scrutinise it, it isn't reliably evidencing what they can do, or it's not valid as well, which goes back to that validity rather. Yeah. So the final one is currency. It's got to be up to date, and it has to be as a direct result of being on the programme. So even if you've got someone who's in service, the evidence that they present must have been generated as part of them being on the programme. It needs to be up to date. So it doesn't mean they can't draw on experiences that they've had previously and compare it to the experiences they're having on programme, but they can't rely on those previous experiences as sole evidence for their portfolio. So bringing it all together, it's got to be genuine, relevant to the training activity, sufficient in quantity, quality, and relevance, and it needs to be up to date. Now, there's types of evidence here, and basically for these specialist modules, it could be a huge array. This is just, some of these are quite general, and underneath these could be lots of different evidence. So you've got action plans, reflections we know about, any responses to case studies. So if we think of DTAs, it might be some things are difficult to plan for. So you might have simulations as well as part of those case studies, which I haven't gotten there. But the simulation itself, though, let's say you use simulation as a tool for them to have the experience, that isn't evidence alone. So them just being engaged in a simulation isn't the evidence. The evidence is what comes from that. So that could be a reflection, well, it will be, but it could be also responses to the questions that they were asked as part of that simulation. It could be a witness testimony of someone observing them doing that simulation, or a direct observation of their practice, all sorts of things that will be the actual evidence for it. So the simulation is the experience, really. Types of evidence to prove their learning from it and engagement with it are here. And you could probably think of even more, but this is just some of the ones that I've come up with there. So you've got reports there, different types of reports. It might be business or service reports, or it could be clinical reports, etc. Okay. witness testimonies we've mentioned, and so on. So those, I'm not going to talk through all those, but what I will say is we've got a module in the Learning Hub, one for trainees and one for trainers, that is about it's a general one about developing evidence for training activities. And in there, it goes through each of these and how they can be used and etc. So if you want to have a look at those, you can have a look at that rather than me talking through those, but we can revisit those if we've got time after. And I've mentioned this before in other talks that I've said that the format of that evidence can be what is appropriate from your perspective and from the trainee's perspective. So I say this about reflections, that there's always this assumption, and we do make this assumption, because of our own experiences of reflection in the past. So, for example, mine, when I was teacher training, we had to have this huge physical portfolio. I'm showing my age, but this huge physical portfolio, and there was, so many reflections in there, and they were all written, etc. Well, if that's good for some people, written reflections are, it creates a barrier. As soon as you say you've got to write down how you felt about this, what you learned from it, they prefer to maybe do that verbally, and that might be verbally just to themselves, so they can record that as an audio or video file, or it might be that they do it, to you or a peer even. So it doesn't have to be yourself that they do that with, and they can record that in an audio or video context. You can do it verbally to you and not record it, but you verbally, they verbally reflect in a one-to-one, and you can record in their one file portfolio that you're happy that they demonstrated the learning from it, that you had a conversation about it, and that they identified the key learning, and that they're able to, you write in your feedback to affirm that that conversation took place, and you might make a comment on it. So there's lots of different ways that they can actually present that evidence, and it doesn't always have to be written. But of course, that is an agreement between you and your trainee as well. I've mentioned before in other in my one on OTAs about triangulation of evidence and how that can, at this, this enables a greater reliability and validity of that evidence, and helps actually with when we're talking about plagiarism and that kind of thing. It can help combat that, because the more you employ that sort of triangulated approach to the evidence, it means that you're not just relying on one piece of evidence to do all the heavy lifting. Doesn't mean that someone's just going to have 3 pieces of evidence. It just means that they're taking that evidence from 3 different sources, if you like, so 3 different types of evidence. So what we've got there, we've got conversations, work products, and observations. So conversations are things like questioning, could be professional discussions, feedback from different sources, so that could include patients or colleagues. But also you can see reflections as a form of conversation with yourself, so a trainee can see that, using things like reflections can be that, especially if it's self-reflection, so they do it as a solo activity. But if they do it, as we said before, that they do it in a peer context, or they do it with you, so you ask them reflective questioning, and it could actually be using the tool that I've developed, that guide on reflecting for DTAs or ETAs. Then it's got questions there that you can actually use to elicit more reflective thinking, and they can either use that on their own or you can use it with them. Then that forms part of that conversations type. Observations might be assessor observing the trainee performing a task. It could be a peer observing the trainee doing a task and giving them some feedback. It could be the trainee observing others and reflecting on that. Could be witness testimonies by an expert witness, as in somebody who has the credentials to be making a judgment about what the trainee is doing. And then finally, work products. So that could be anything, and it could be anything from what we were talking about before. If I go back, work product could be things like clinical reports, business or service reports. It could be anything like if they've had to write a SOP or review a SOP, or if they've contributed to that. It could be slides from a presentation they've delivered, anything at all that's related to that activity, basically. Action plans, it could even be certificates the trainee has achieved. So if they did some training related to their role, but it wasn't part of the actual program, then they can include that alongside their reflection on it, because it kind of proves they did it, but that certificate does, but it doesn't prove what they learned from it, so that they can do the reflection as part of that. If they, if they like redid some patient information leaflet, then they can show what it was originally and what they produced in comparison, and why they produced it in the way they did. So there's lots of scope there for that. So here's my dodgy diagram again, but this again is to illustrate. So you've got your evidence that they've undertaken the activity. So for the DTA, that might be one or two pieces of evidence that they show that they actually undertook it. Whereas with the entrustable, there might be multiple pieces of evidence that they're showing. And as a collective, so if we go back over to the developmental training activity, the evidence they're going to produce for the evidence they're going to produce for that DTA is going to show evidence that they've undertaken the activity. Then they're going to have evidence of reflection, and then they're going to have evidence of action planning. Whereas for the entrustable training activities, they might have multiple incidences of that. So multiple incidences that they undertook it, multiple incidences of them actually reflecting on it, and multiple incidences of them having mini action plans for it. So what they're going to do in the short or medium term to actually then better engage with that activity. Again, hopefully that makes sense.